It's important the industry collaborates against all of this at the moment, because it's bigger than any one company. You know, the UK industry needs to solve some of these problems, and the UK supply chain needs to solve some of these problems. So it's not an individual developer's problem; it's an industry-wide problem to overcome.
Hello and welcome to Property Perspectives, a NatWest podcast all about sustainability in the real estate space. I'm your host, Ashley Toy. Today, I'm joined by Stephen Andrew, Group Technical Director at Taylor Wimpey. Thank you very much for coming in. We're here to talk about your zero carbon ready homes. So let's get into it. So I think if we could start at the beginning with all of this. So when you went back to thinking about this project, what were the problems you were trying to solve and how did you go about thinking about it?
Yes, it's quite a big challenge, this, and very topical for the moment. So there's a few parts to this. The overarching part is probably the government ambition around zero carbon. We know the UK government has stated its ambitions around 2050, around trying to get the UK to decarbonise. So that's an overarching ambition to this. What sits then in behind from Taylor Wimpey's point of view is that we actually launched our net zero transition plan back in 2023, which committed Taylor Wimpey to actually moving a bit faster than that. So we recommitted to 2045 instead of 2050. And within that as well, there was ambitions around 2030 in terms of decarbonising our house type range.
Yep.
So that by 2030 we were building, net zero ready homes across the UK. So that's our commitment, and what this trial then was trying to do is understand how we deliver against that commitment, and testing all of the component parts, which you can imagine is quite varied. There's specifications, there's compliance, there's building regulations, there's suppliers, there's subcontractors, there's skills, and then ultimately in the middle of all of that, the most important part is customer.
Yeah.
Someone's going to buy these homes at the end of the day. So there's a lot of moving parts to consider. So the trial essentially was designed to try and address all of that, find out where the gaps in our knowledge were, find out where the gaps in our suppliers and subcontractors' knowledge were, and then ultimately try and start to understand what the optimal specification may well be for our customers as we move towards these zero carbon ready homes.
So I think the trial point is actually quite pertinent, right? So we're only at trial stage and yet you've still got a lot to do to kind of get this to a mass point. So you talked about some of the challenges there. What were the big hurdles when you were starting to get into this?
Yeah, I think the hurdles, the government's consulted twice now on future home standards. So we're waiting for the future home standard to be published, which we're expecting to be summer this year. With that, the publication of future home standard, that will also come with the energy modelling software that the developers require to be able to test combinations of specifications and the performance of the houses. So one of our main challenges is we don't have that yet. So we are working to what the government has previously published through the consultations, which is, what we understand that to be then is a 75 to 80% reduction in carbon emissions from our homes from the 2013 building regulations, and the very likely electrification of homes. So that's two of the kind of fundamental points that we expect to come with future home standard, and it was two of the fundamental points of our trial. So how do we electrify our homes, and how do we achieve that level of carbon emission reduction in our homes? So that was probably the starting point. For us then, the challenge is, if you're setting out on quite an ambitious and coordinated trial, we chose to do it on a live site. And that was very deliberate. And the reason for doing it on a live site was we wanted to understand the challenges of doing it on a live site with our existing subcontractors, with our existing suppliers, because that would very quickly identify where the gaps in knowledge were, the gaps in skills, the gaps in the product pipelines, and so on and so forth. So, and also just the natural challenges of building in the live environment outside.
And you've got to have a supply base, I guess, that wants to work with you on this job.
Absolutely. So, that was the kind of basis of it. After that point, then it was all about finding the right site, because we wanted to move quickly on it, and we couldn't wait for a brand new site to go through the planning process, which can often take quite considerable time. So we had to move on a site that was already live or very close to being live, and the planning position was such that it could accommodate these kind of future homes within the plots. What was also quite difficult was we wanted to try on as many different house typologies as we could to make it as representative of our house type range across the UK. So we actually set a competition within the business for all of our 22 business units to come back to us to, offer sites to us that they think could achieve the brief. And the brief was essentially we wanted 5 plots that we could isolate from the rest of the site so that when we did get to the point of letting visitors come to the site, it was safe.
Yeah.
But over those 5 plots, we wanted detached homes, semi-detached homes, 2-story, 2.5-story, so we could get quite a variety of house typologies to test.
Not asking for much then. Yeah.
Well, it was a bit of a test, to be fair. It was a bit of a test, but we did find it. And our TW London business unit had an appropriate site. It had planning consent, so we were already on building, and we could carve out this little pocket of 5 houses that we could go and launch the trial against. So that all worked really successfully, and that model worked really well within our business as well. So that was trial number 1 in terms of just identifying the site and the right plots. Then it was actually trying to understand what's in the market. What products exist within the UK.
Yeah.
If you look broader into Europe, some of the European countries have moved faster than the UK in terms of decarbonising. So if you look at Ireland, you look at Holland, France, they've already been building with the air source heat pump and electric technologies for quite a considerable period. So we went to the various countries, we met with developers, we met with suppliers, and we did a lot of work to understand their experience with decarbonising housing, fitting some of the specification into houses. And we also have our Spanish operation as well, which is fully electric as well. So we've got good expertise already within our business unit we could draw some experience from. So we looked out with the UK. We did look in the UK. We engaged with our suppliers to understand what they had just now, but also importantly, what was in their innovation pipeline, what hadn't hit the shelves yet that we could perhaps offer them the opportunity to trial with us on our site, which is what we did with quite a few suppliers. So there was quite a few areas to look at there. Our subcontractors had to probably learn quite quickly because they're used to building with us, so they perhaps weren't used to some of the low carbon tech that we're going to trial here. But we didn't want to bring specialists in because these are the guys we're going to have to work with in the future. So we wanted to train them and bring them on and test their competencies and learn from them and their experience of introducing us into the houses. Other challenges is actually house type design.
Yeah.
We run with standard portfolios across the UK, and they're tailored locally to planning requirements and the likes, but we tried to run a standard portfolio for efficiency. But with electrification, that does change things. Just now we might build a house with a combination gas boiler, which serves heating and hot water to that house. When you move to electrification, that could be an air source heat pump, it could be some other technology, but it'll likely require a hot water cylinder in the house, which you wouldn't have space for just now in our current
space is big here.
Absolutely. So you've got to suddenly find more space, but you don't kind of want to steal it from the customer. You don't want to take it from existing storage within the house. So that's quite a difficult balance you've got to get right there, and you've got to come up with some innovative solutions, which we're looking at the moment. Other things like sometimes some of the houses, the radiators need to get a lot bigger because it's running at lower flow temperatures within the house. So we see some changes there, which then might affect furniture layouts, stair positions, kitchen designs, and so on and so forth. So the design part of the house needs quite careful consideration depending on which specification options you choose.
Well, I can imagine that whilst you're thinking about this, you could quite quickly find yourself in a position you end up completely redesigning your house type without really thinking about it because you're making so many minor changes. Yeah. So I guess thinking about the technology that you've got, I always find it a bit interesting where you can have some really interesting tech, but it would be so small scale that actually even if you wanted to use it, you couldn't really scale it up. So how did you go about making that balance between innovation and new and I guess stuff that was already there but you could apply today?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point because there were technologies that we trialled that did perform well, but in today's market weren't scalable.
Yeah.
Maybe in a few years' time they would be, but right now we couldn't just deploy it across our business. There were others that we could. There's others that when you're looking at Europe, trying to ensure there's a robust supply chain into the UK for some of the products. Yeah, there's a bit of work to do there. And equally, some of the products that were performing well in Europe when we did our tour there, when you bring them back to the UK and you push them through the energy software that the UK SAP assessors use, it suddenly didn't perform as well.
Yeah.
And that can often be down to the electric tariffs versus the gas tariffs and things like that. So we did have occasion where one of the technologies that we put into the house actually made the house perform worse than the gas equivalent of the house. So then we had to put additional technologies into that house to bring it back to an EPC-B to be able to sell it. So that was very interesting, because what that taught us was we can't just take something in Europe that's really successful and just drop it straight into the UK and expect it to perform to the same efficiency. There were other things as well, like air source heat pumps. There's a lot of talk about air source heat pump in the press. That's likely going to be part of the solution for sure. But there's a lot of challenges with air source heat pumps as well. They're large units, they're heavy. The sequencing of getting them into the plot, we would normally have boilers connected and drying out the house a bit earlier with an air source heat pump. That gets delivered later to the plot. So we need to think about our sequencing and timing and things. Equally, things like health and safety, about how you get an air source heat pump delivered to a location, perhaps in the back garden. How do you do that safely? When do you do that safely? So it changes a few things in terms of how we would approach a house today to how we approach a house tomorrow in terms of installation of that. We were also just on air source heat pump. We were the first in the UK to install an air source heat pump in the loft.
Right, okay.
And that was very innovative and solved quite a few problems, because this is, they're quite big pieces of kit. They can vibrate, they can be a little bit noisy. Now, we mitigate all of that in our designs, and in the houses where we had external air source heat pumps, we carried out noise surveys and vibration surveys and things to make sure, from a customer point of view, it was absolutely satisfactory. Taking them into the loft, though, removes all of that. So the planning authority on the site was particularly interested in the noise of these machines. Now, when you hear them, they're actually very quiet. Yeah. So, I don't think there's really a problem there, but, we still had to satisfy the planning department. Putting them into
new, isn't it? So you've got...
Well, exactly. And there's lots of questions, and there's lots of kind of hearsay and different things that creeps out. So you've kind of got to disprove a lot of that. Putting it into the loft, created a situation where it solved quite a lot of those problems for us. But then it did generate other problems, because it's a heavy piece of equipment taken up into the roof space and so on. But, it dealt with security concerns and vibration, noise concerns and things. So there's different ways of solving the same puzzle, I think, is what the trial taught us.
And how, I guess we've talked a bit about the suppliers there. You've talked about a lot of things there that impact how a supplier interacts with you and the house. What was their general reaction, and what were some of the things you had to overcome with them?
Well, the general reaction, and I'd say it's pretty consistent, was they were all excited and very keen to work with us. They were keen to test their knowledge, they were keen to test their competence, but they were also recognising opportunities to work with us and trial their own products in our homes, because ultimately, being a live site trial, these houses were then marketed and sold. So we've got customers living in the five homes, which we are continuing to measure and monitor the performance of them. So these suppliers also get the benefit of how their products perform. So they probably could get to market maybe slightly quicker with some of the products. So I would say it was very much a partnership with the supply chain. Lots of really interesting conversations, lots of learnings, some things that didn't go as well as planned, and other things that probably performed a little bit better than planned. So that's the purpose of the trial. Ultimately, it doesn't all necessarily work. So where we identified some challenges, we found ways to overcome that. And as I started, the starting point was there's a customer at the end of all of this. So we had to act with the best interests of the customers, and that's where we always pulled the conversation back to. And ultimately, on the consumer cost piece, the move to electric, that's one of the most important parts. We need to be very careful about getting the consumer cost part right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess if you're doing something like a trial and pushing the boundary slightly, you're probably not pushing hard enough if you're getting absolutely everything right.
Well, that's right. Absolutely. And, I don't think there's an awful lot of value of just testing things that are available on the market just now. There is value in that, but the innovation part, really pushing the supply chain to innovate. The zero carbon journey is not just about house emissions, it's also about things like embodied carbon. How much carbon is in that product and the manufacture of that product and getting it to site. So, we've got responsibility there to push our supply chain to consider all aspects of their products.
Okay. And when we're thinking about, I guess, the finished products, what was the market reaction to the finished products, I guess, outside of the customer base? And then maybe if we could move through to what the customers have said and how they do.
Yeah, we we were quite open about this trial. So, I think it's important just now, the industry, and it's been proven through some of the industry groups that we represent upon. Um, it's important the industry collaborates against all of this at the moment, because it's bigger than any one company. The UK industry needs to solve some of these problems, and the UK supply chain needs to solve some of these problems. So it's not an individual developer's problem; it's an industry-wide problem to overcome. So that said, we actually opened up. We built a visitor centre as part of the trial, so we ended up with about 500 or 600 visitors through a whole series of guided tours across the summer of 2023. And that, that was all sorts. That was internal stakeholders within Taylor Wimpey. It was investors, analysts. It was insurers, banking, surveyors, lenders, NHBC, HBF. It was a whole plethora of very interested stakeholders across industry. And the response was excellent. So, the feedback was, we did do obviously a feedback questionnaire as part of that, and it was overwhelmingly very positive. In the trial itself, we trialed 5 houses over the different typologies, but each of those individual houses had a completely different set of specifications. So there was different combinations of products in each of the 5 houses. So each house told us something different and told them something different as well. So they found it very interesting, and we shared a lot of information. As I say, it's an industry problem to overcome rather than a Taylor Wimpey problem to overcome. And we also did, we offered out calls to the SMEs. So HBF organised some calls with the SMEs where we had, I can't remember exactly the numbers, but it was a couple hundred people on from SMEs just to learn our lessons from our trial. So it was very, very, very open. We shared a lot of information. There was a lot of good learnings from it to tell industry and tell interested stakeholders, but also to challenge.
Yes.
To challenge, people like valuers, surveyors. They're stepping into this world of low carbon housing, and we were challenging that. There was one of the houses which was very much designed to not necessarily to meet the future home standard, because we think we know what that'll look like. This was test the boundaries of what's possible. So this was the kind of art of the possible.
Yeah.
And that house had the capability of delivering zero bills. It was a smart house that, traded the energy grids for you. It learned your movements and patterns within the house, when you needed hot water, when you would need lighting, and so on and so forth. So that was quite an interesting house. But if that had the possibility of zero bills, then the lenders and surveyors then considered the affordability of that house compared to the existing housing market. And does that change the affordability calculations if your energy bills are now dropping down? Does that, change that conversation? So we were challenging back to the stakeholders as well.
Good, yeah.
And, to be fair to all of these groups, it's new for them.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to understand this and what it means for their business models and so on.
And classically, people like to have seen stuff proven, don't they? So
Of course.
there's a bit of a dynamic in the middle. So yeah, great that you're challenging back. And so the people that have been living in the homes probably haven't been living in them for too long, but are you getting feedback? If you've not, when are you planning to do it?
Yeah, so we are getting feedback, and we've done some sessions with the customers. One of the main things we're doing is actually just testing the performance of the house. So one of the key principles of the trial originally was to get seasonal data over the 4 seasons, so we understand how each of the 5 different specifications work through winter, summer, and so on and so forth. So we're just about through that now. We're just compiling the final data on that. We've now been through the winter cycle. So that's, again, teaching us a few lessons about some of the combinations perhaps working better than expected, some perhaps not working as well as expected, but still well. And this, it's all part of the trial, is just understanding, what we think is going to happen, what the energy software tells us, what the suppliers think the product does to what actually happens. But, ultimately the customers live in their own way in their house, so they'll demand a different amount of, I'd maybe needing different heating from you, or a different amount of hot water. So, it's difficult to compare across the 5 plots, but what we can do is kind of compare against the average of that type of house that we would build under gas. And then you start to understand what the difference is. But the customer feedback's been positive. I think there's been good feedback from customers as well about some of the products, some of the interfaces with some of the products. I think one of the main challenges the industry will face is about customer education. Things like underfloor heating, for example, excellent product, But if you're not used to having had underfloor heating, you might not understand that it takes quite a long time to heat up the ground floor slab. So you're better to have it on all the time at a very low value rather than switching it on and off like you might with a heating system with radiators, because it won't perform like that. So there's education bits we've picked up, and we've developed education for customers in the way of kind of QR codes and animations and things through our showrooms. So that's helped us, but also helped our suppliers develop their products.
Yeah.
And develop the interface with customers and their products. So customer education, I think, is critically important, but equally so is the competence of the contractor installing it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, they've had a lot of good feedback to us as well from some of the products, some of the challenges they faced.
Yeah, great. So what's the next milestone for you on this?
Next milestone. So there's a few. Mentioned future home standards, so we're expecting that to come out in summer.
Mm-hmm.
So when that comes out, we will, be moving very swiftly on to testing all of our assumptions, testing some of our conclusions, so that we can settle on a specification, firm up supply chain arrangements, and prepare for the future in that respect. We've got other trials going on, in the same site that we did the 5-plot trial. We've just recently connected, just before Christmas, a series of customers onto our first air source heat pump network with GTC. So that's a community-based heating network solution. So you don't have an air source heat pump in the plot. It's all done in a community centre. So that's quite interesting as well in terms of a large scale site. So we're monitoring that trial as well. So we're doing lots of innovation still. There's a lot of work around how we accommodate the products in the homes and how we innovate, perhaps we might put them within the homes, and with the customer in mind again, that we're not diminishing their experience and diminishing the storage available to them and so on. So quite a lot of work going on around there just now in prep for the future home standard coming. So really that's where we are at the moment. There's a lot of trial, a lot of innovation going on just now, a lot of prep work to these regulatory changes that we're expecting this year.
So not much to do then?
No, not at all.
So I guess bringing it to the present day, like, what if you could give one piece of advice to a property developer, what would it be?
I would listen to your customers, engage your supply chain early, understand your own subcontract base and what their challenges and limitations, but also experience that they can bring to the table is, and then just consider what you want to choose to offer your customer, because I think in the past the building regulations dictated a lot of the homes were quite similar from a specification point of view.
Yeah.
Whereas now, as we move into future home standards, there's a lot more choice. So you can choose, do you go to air source heat pump? Do you go to PV panels? Do you go to underfloor heating? Do you go to radiators? There's all manner of choice now. Yeah. So, understand your customer base, understand your subcontractor strengths, and understand your supply chain. That's what you need to get right.
And a final quick-fire one for you then. What was the biggest learning for you throughout this process?
Yeah, so the biggest learning, I would say, is education. Really, education of our designers, of how they're going to design homes, education of the designers around specification of homes and the combination of specification. Our suppliers, education.
Yep.
How are they going to innovate? How are they going to bring these products? How are they tackling carbon emissions, but how are they also tackling embodied carbon? Education of subcontractors. We've got really talented subcontract partners, but this does change things slightly. So, there's some new competencies to learn. There's some new approaches to learn. And then ultimately the education of our customers, which comes from perhaps some of our sales execs teams, and how they explain when they're selling the products to customers. But ultimately, the customers are going to be living in these homes, which are going to be zero carbon ready homes, which may be a little bit different from what they're used to living in. Now, it is quite exciting.
Yeah.
It is exciting. But I think we just need to get that education piece right through industry and to customers, and then it will be a success.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about, I guess, the broader climate journey, we are still in that education piece and moving into action over time. But yeah, you've got to do the education first. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for another episode of Property Perspectives. I've been your host, Ashley Toy. Please remember, if you enjoyed the episode, click like and subscribe.